Throughout American history, the struggle for equality has been at the heart of the nation's evolution. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a pivotal moment, but to understand its significance, we need to look at the battles before it, court cases that shaped the path towards justice. Today, we will explore the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through landmark court cases Dred Scott versus Sandford, Plessy versus Ferguson, and Brown versus the Board of Education, and how they paved the way for the rights and responsibilities we continue to face today. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 abolished discrimination regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, or religion. This act led to the Civil Rights Act like the ones of 1965, 1968, and 1990. Today, this act continues to pave and shape the USA. This act led minorities like African Americans and Mexican descent to be free from segregation. Africans can use the same bathrooms as whites, sit anywhere on the bus, and eat at the same restaurants as whites. This is more than a normal act. The act allows for the government and the people to think about the difference the act made and how life was for colored people before and after the passing. This act shapes the way we think and speak about other subjects and topics like rights for immigrants and rights for people of the LGBTQ community, for example. To understand the reasoning, cause and effect of the act being passed, we have to understand the times before it. The story begins in 1857 with the case of Dred Scott versus Sandford. Dred Scott was an enslaved African American man. He sued for his freedom after living in the free estates with his owner, Dr. John Emerson. Emerson argued because he had lived in Illinois and Wisconsin, the territories where slavery was banned, he should be granted his freedom. However, the Supreme Court's decision was devastating. The Supreme Court ruled 7-2 against Scott. The Chief Justice, Roger B. Taney, wrote the majority opinion, declaring that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, were not citizens and therefore had no right to sue in federal court. The court went further, stating that Congress had no authority to ban slaves in territories, effectively invalidating the Missouri Compromise, which had attempted to stop slavery's expansion. This ruling not only denied Dred Scott his freedom, but also reinforced the idea that Black Americans were inferior to white Americans. The decision established the legal and social justification for slavery across the nation. This laid the groundwork for the conflicts leading up to the Civil War. The Dred Scott decision almost completely destroyed any hopes of racial equality. It encouraged more legal and social discrimination, thus leaving Black Americans with little hope of protection under the law. The ruling angered Americans across the US, especially in the North, and contributed to the political disputes that led to the Civil War. In 1964, after years of protests, marches, and legal challenges, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. This landmark legislation was the culmination of decades of struggle and marked a decisive victory in the fight for racial equality. Nearly 40 years after Dred Scott, the struggle for equality had another severe setback. In 1896, the Supreme Court heard the case of Plessy versus Ferguson. This case was based on a deliberate act of defiance by a man named Homer Plessy. He was a man of mixed race who sat in a whites-only railroad car in Louisiana, challenging the state segregation laws. The court's decision in Plessy would forever change the legal landscape of racial segregation in America. In a 7-1 ruling, the Supreme Court said that they would uphold the constitutionality of segregation, establishing the doctrine of separate but equal. This decision legalized racial segregation and provided a legal basis for Jim Crow laws that spread throughout the southern states over time. The Plessy ruling was one of the most catastrophic decisions that could have been made. It established a firm ruling of racial inequality in almost every aspect of life, ranging from schools and public transportation to theaters and restaurants. Separate but equal became the law of the land, and for decades it justified a system of racism. While the court claimed that separate facilities were equal, The reality was far from it. Facilities for Black Americans were often subpar, underfunded, and unsafe. This legal ruling, which would stand for nearly 60 years, made it clear that racial inequality would persist in the US, leaving generations to fight against the oppressive system it legitimized. Plessy created a precedent that would make future battles for racial equality increasingly harder. But it also sparked a powerful response. As Black Americans endured the segregation and discrimination, they would begin to mobilize for a change in their lives. The road to endure discrimination was long, but the Plessy decision, even with all its injustice, eventually served as a rallying reason for future civil rights movements. Brown versus the Board of Education. Even with the ruling of Plessy going in favor of the Supreme Court, people still protested and defied Jim Crow laws, as they believed in fair practices and equal rights for both races. One popular organization that protested hard for equality, founded in 1909, was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Charles Hamilton Houston was the leader of this group for a long time. The group operated from 1934 to 1938. Marshall Goodall and Charles Houston created a plan to attack the Educational Board of the U.S. In 1954, nearly 60 years after Plessy, the Civil Rights Act movement had gained momentum, and the Supreme Court had another opportunity to address segregation. The case of Brown versus the Board of Education challenged the doctrine of separate but equal in public schools. In a unanimous decision, the court declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This ruling overturned Plessy, rejecting the notion that segregation could ever be truly equal. It marked a turning point in the battle for civil rights and was a critical moment in the dismantling of legalized segregation. The Brown decision had far-reaching consequences. It not only challenged segregation in schools, but also laid the foundation for challenging segregation in all areas of public life, igniting the civil rights movement that would ultimately lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, and sex, or national origin. It outlawed segregation in schools, public places, employment, and created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to enforce these rights. Although the law did not instantly erase racial inequality, it was a powerful statement. Nation's commitment to change. It laid the groundwork for further advancements in civil rights and showed that legal victories were possible. Even in the face of overwhelming opposition, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave Americans the legal tools to challenge discrimination. But the fight for equality continues. Today, we continue to find our way through the complex of rights and responsibilities. Even if it's in the workplace, in education, or in our communities, what we've learned from Dred Scott, Plessy, and Brown is that legal battles are not only about courtroom decisions. They reflect the morality of the nation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a victory, but its success depended on the ongoing commitment to the principle of justice. These struggles reminded us that rights need to be fought for, and once won, they should be preserved for our future generations. As we continue to face challenges in the fight for equality, the legacy of the Civil Rights Act endures, reminding us all of our responsibility.